Those changes brings different seasons. I'm talking about culturally. Now it's football time, isn't it? And some people go, yes, finally. And I know others are like, who cares? There's so many different subcultures in our culture that dominate people's lives. And when we think about the NFL, well, college football for that matter, billions of dollars are generated by this sport. And when one individual gets a contract for upwards of $150 million, like, wow, they're putting a lot of value on that person in that position for playing a game. You know, and that sends a message to the rest of the world, doesn't it? When you can get paid that kind of money, it's telling people this is important. This is valuable. You know, this is significant. This person has arrived and is successful. And you say, well, how does that affect each individual? Some of them might not become sports stars, but it filters down and affects all of us, doesn't it, about what the world's view of success is. And it's so easy to get entrapped in that. But there's so many other cultures in there. I'm talking about subcultures within the world. There's, with a horse culture, horse people are nice people. When we had horses, the people we hung around, they're all sometimes the nicest people around. There's sports people or sports culture. There's the outdoor culture, people that just love to go outdoors. They're generally really nice people too, in touch with nature. There's the business culture, people that are into finance and money and building corporations. And some of them can be ruthless and some can be very nice as well. There's the farm culture and the back to the earth culture. Everywhere you go, there's different subsets, aren't there? Now, what am I saying? The world presents to us so many things to get involved with, and they dictate often about what success looks like, how to be significant, and yet so many people feel so lost, don't they? They're just wandering around looking for their place in society, looking to fit in. And you say, well, that's not the rest of the world. You know, you go to other places, you know, they don't have all these things. Yeah, but in Africa, you know what everybody wants to do in Africa? Come to the United States. Because the message they hear through the media and through the internet is, this is what success looks like, way it looks in the United States of America. They want to come here. And yet so many people are lost. They're still wandering. And so we've been talking about this spiritual battle before us. And a lot of people recognize there's got to be more to life than just some of these cultures that we presented. And so now we have the counterculture, don't we? Every generation has had their counterculture. And you say, what are you talking about? Some of you are too young, I know, but beatniks in the 50s. They were the people that wore this French kind of beret hat. They smoked cigarettes out of a holder. They had black turtleneck sweaters, and they listened to beat music. And they were the rage, and they were, you know, the counterculture of its day. In fact, you could get a beatnik kit and order it online, and so you could look just like them. That was replaced in the 60s, 70s by the hippies. And basically, what are they saying? Like, this isn't world is large. And it was a counterculture because there's got to be more to life than money and the war. And so they were protesting all those things. Now, some of it was legitimate. Some of it was altruistic, but a lot of them used an excuse just for sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Because they wanted to reject all of culture and do exactly what they wanted. And so some have said, rightly so, that the 70s or the hippie generation was the most decadent culture there's ever been in our modern history. But, you know, it's interesting. We don't do fashion. We are fashion. And it's dictated a lot of the fashion today. Tie-dyed, long hair, headbands, hippies, and peace. Well, that was replaced when you go on with punk. Now, a lot of you going, yeah, I never did get that one. Well, I'm one of those. But it's really the same culture, just in another generation. They're saying there's got to be more to life than just what I see around us. So they look rebellious, and some of them are. But a lot of them are attracted to it because they're looking for meaning or something significant in life. And so then we can go on. There's hip hop, and then there's rap, and then there's the gothic culture. And I just can't keep up with them. And we born, I would give them credit, the hipster movement, all right? And you say, well, that's cool. Well, it's a culture within the culture, isn't it? Long birds, plaid shirts, you know, and just got to drive a Subaru as well, all right? But yet so many people are lost, aren't they? They're still looking because all these promise so much, but they deliver so little. And that's why we've been talking about the battle before us, that we're spiritual beings living in a physical world. And we're in a battle, and a text we haven't looked at a lot, I don't even know if we referred to it yet, it's found in 2 Timothy chapter 2, where Paul encourages the young man Timothy how to deal with those who are in opposition to the truth. And he says you got to be gentle, correcting those who are in opposition. And he says the purpose is, here's the goal, that we might help them come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil, having been, and catch this, enslaved by him to do his will. So when you just take the first part of that verse, come to their senses, that might sound pretty patronizing. Like, what do you mean that we're not thinking correctly? Who are you to judge that? No, I'm not the one saying it. And it's modified by the fact that you've been held captive by Satan, who is the great liar, isn't he? The great deceiver. He wants you to believe this is good and acceptable and will make you significant, offer great promises, Lord, but he's lying to you. And when you give in to his system, his culture, you're going to be held captive by him, and the only way to get you to escape is to open your mind and come to your senses. Boy, and that speaks so much of us, to so many of us, in the world at large around us. And that's why we talked about this battle, because Satan is trying to capture each and every one of us. And he is our only sole enemy, Satan. And we review that. There's two battlefronts. We saw that there's a battlefront without, that's the world and its culture that's trying to impose upon us, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life. Then there's the battle within us. That's the flesh, and that's where we looked at last week, this battle. And it's so serious that we find in Galatians chapter 5 that as long as you walk according to the flesh, you cannot do the things of the Spirit. You cannot please God. You can't do what you want. So the question was, how are we going to escape? And that's the message that we want to consider this morning, where Paul says in Galatians chapter 5, verse 16, but I say, walk by the Spirit. Walk by the Spirit. It's just that simple. Walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. You'll be free from it. And he goes on to say, because the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit against the flesh. They're in opposition to one another, and so you cannot do the things you please. It's like oil and water. My mom, bless her heart, she had a 69 Nova, nice car. She wrecked it, but that's another story. Dad said, make sure you check the oil, and because we don't make sure. So she's down at the gas station, sure it's low, and so she puts oil in the first hole she sees, and it's the radiator. Now, does oil and water mix together? No, you got to drain it all and start again. And we understand that. That's why y'all went, oh. But do we understand it when it comes to the Spirit and the flesh? They don't mix together. They're in opposition to one another. And if you want to overcome the desires of the flesh and defeat Satan, he just says, walk by the Spirit. And you say, well, what does that mean? How do we walk by the Spirit? Because are we going to get in kind of just mystical realm? What does it mean to walk by the Spirit? It's interesting. This statement is nowhere made anywhere in Scripture in this context. We're never told to walk in the Lord. It says walk worthy of the Lord. Walk worthy of your calling. Walk in love just as God loved you. But nowhere does it say walk in Christ or walk in God. It says walk in the Spirit. Walk itself is God's term from his perspective to describe all of life's activities as he's looking down on to walk down on this third rock from the sun. Because every day we repeat some of the same behaviors, and given the same circumstances, we respond generally always in the same way. So when he just looks at these patterns, he says, there's their behavior. That's how they walk. So walk means behave. It's the way you carry out your life according to the opportunities and the stimulus and the things that happen to you every. So what does it mean, walk by the Spirit? We're going to try to answer that in just a brief way, and then we'll have to expound upon it later. But it's really not that hard. We're going to look at 3 points. You're going to either walk by the flesh or walk by the Spirit. And when you see the contrast, maybe it'll help you understand what walking by the Spirit is. Second point is you're going to walk according to how you think. And if you think spiritually, you're going to walk spiritually. If you think worldly, you're going to walk worldly. So it's all about here, how you think. And the way you think like the Spirit, so you can walk by the Spirit, is letting the Spirit dwell in you. That's our third point. Letting the Spirit dwell in you, so you're truly sons of God. So really, the first point, we're to see that. There's 2 ways you're going to walk. You're going to walk by the flesh, or you're going to walk by the Spirit. Now, I want you all to turn to Romans 8. Romans 8 is an amazing chapter. It was read for us partly by J.C., but Paul is talking about our responsibility as Christians to let the Spirit live in us so we can walk by the Spirit. He starts in verse 1 with this beautiful promise, for you and me in Christ, there's no condemnation. There's nothing you and I can be accused of, because what Christ did for us is set us free from the law of condemnation and death. That's in verse 2 and verse 3. And verse 4 is so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us. And who is the us? Us who do not walk according to the flesh, but he says, but according to the Spirit. So here's the contrast. Christians do not any longer walk according to the flesh, but they walk by the Spirit. Verse 5, for those who are according to the flesh, here's our second point, a preview, set their minds on things of the flesh. They're worldly minded. But those who are according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For the mindset on the flesh is death, but the mindset on the Spirit is life and peace. Because of this, the mindset on the flesh is hostile toward God. It does not subject itself to the law of God. It's not even able to do so. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. So here, the first thing I want you to see is there's 2 ways to walk. You're going to either, come back to it. You're going to either walk in the flesh or you're going to walk in the Spirit. Let's describe walking in the flesh. It's not always bad. We already described how we're intimately tied as a spirit living in a body to our body. And sometimes we confuse the 2 together. But let's just go through what happens when you get up every morning. It's pretty much the same for everyone. And we'll demonstrate again how intimately tied our spirit is, the real me, to our body. So what's the first thing you do when you get out of bed in the morning? Now, I know some of you say, get dressed, check your iPhone, get some coffee. No, there's something you do all before that, especially as you get older. You go to the bathroom. Isn't that true? That's the first path you take. When God's looking up, there they go, every morning to the bathroom. It's because it's a biological urge, and you can describe what's happening, but it affects you spiritually, the real you, like, I gotta go. And if you don't go, is it going to upset the rest of your morning? Yes. And so you all go, and you're walking according to the flesh. Now, that's not all bad, because some things are necessary to maintain life on this earth so we can walk in the Spirit. Now, what's the second thing you do? This is where we take different paths. Some of you go out in your skivvies and get your first cup of coffee, because your body's saying, I need coffee. I mean, the caffeine wore off from the day before. I didn't get enough sleep because I was up too late, and I'm groggy. If I don't get some coffee, I'm not going to be able to function. Now, is that a bodily reaction or a spiritual one? That's all body, isn't it? But the body dictates, and you just kind of, on automatic pilots, it's amazing how we can make coffee half asleep, right? But it's the body perhaps just doing it for us. Now, some of you say, no, I don't get coffee. But you might go get some Cocoa Puffs. Or some of you, what you eat for breakfast is beyond me. Well, I did it too, just like tricks or for kids. I guess we're all still kids as we grow up. Some of you might get clothed. Say, I'm cold, so I'm going to put something on. Some of you might shower. All those things are feeding the flesh. Then we get in our car, and we're driving to our place of employment. We've done it 1,000 times. Maybe we're on the freeway, and we're doing the speed limit or just slightly above it, and someone races beside us and cuts right in front of us. We have to slam on the brakes to serve the right, and we just lose it. There is a cortisol rush in your body that produces more adrenaline, and all your senses get heightened. Your body starts to race as your heart pounds more blood. And then what do? Words come out of your mouth of anger. You might shake your fist. You might speed up and pull down your window and say something or make a gesture. What is that? We're not talking about just taking care of basic necessities in the morning. This is walking in the flesh. This is letting the world's system of pride of life. You've been disrespected, dishonored, and you need to avenge yourself. No one has a right to do that to you, and so you're going to get even with them. This is not just a biological function. This is walking in the flesh. This is walking the way the world dictates. And that's why Paul says you can't do both. Either you walk in the flesh or you walk in the Spirit. Now, walk in the Spirit's different. It's because you don't listen to the voices of your body as Lord. Now, sometimes we have to listen to what our body's saying and understand that because it's the only body to function on this earth. Beings need a body to function. I could not talk to you without my body. So I have to take care of my voice. I have to get enough sleep on Saturday night. I have to do all the things necessary to function spiritually. But there's another voice that is crying. And it's the voice of God. It's the Spirit. And God is wanting us to walk by the Spirit, is to listen to its cry more than the cries of the flesh. And when we listen to its dictates and its calls for action, and when we heed it and ignore the flesh, and we're dominated by the Spirit, that's when it's said, to be said, we're walking by the Spirit. And you say, okay, I see the concept. Can you illustrate it? Well, we'll try to do that in this lesson. I just want you to see the concept, that it's either the flesh or the Spirit. And we're going to see in Galatians chapter 3 that the fruit of the Spirit, and the first thing is love. You cannot be walking in the Spirit in that morning commute, rolling down your window and shaking your fist at that person and say, I walk in the Spirit. And so how do you walk in the Spirit? What has to go on for that to take place in our life? Well, that's what we want to see. And I suggested our second point is you're going to walk according to the way that you think. Because if your mind is set on the things of the flesh, that's how you're going to walk. If your mind is set on the things of the Spirit, that's how you're going to walk. And so we see in the next text, that Paul says in Romans chapter 8, you're not in the flesh. You don't set your mind on the things of the flesh. No longer. But he says, we're in the Spirit. And he says, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now, a lot of people, what does that mean? And this conversation gets scary because a lot of people get mystical and they just go, what is that all the time about the Spirit dwell in you? We'll try to make some sense of it. But Paul goes on to say, if you don't have the Spirit, you don't even belong to Christ. So this is not just an option. Those that are Christians, they have to have the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of God living in them. But if Christ's Spirit is in you, even though the body is dead, it's going to die eventually, he says, the Spirit is alive. You have a relationship with the Father. But if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he said, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will give life to your mortal body as well. Through his Spirit, again, who he says dwells in you. So here's what we see happening. That when we are walking in the Spirit, if our mind is set on spiritual things, it's going to dictate how we walk. If it's set on worldly things, that'll dictate our walk as being a walk in the flesh. And so when we think about this, there's a way, thinking fleshly. Oh, excuse me, I thought it said freshly. there's a way to think worldly. Everyone has what we call an operating system. You know what I mean by an operating system? When you have a PC, Windows is the operating system that makes all that hardware run so you can interact with the hardware and you can get it to do things you want. Apple has on their MacBooks a different operating system. Even cell phones have operating systems with them. And it depends on what type of service you have. Well, our body and life on this earth, we operate under an operating system, an OS. And it's basically your value system, what you deem important, what you choose to adopt as right and wrong, your system of morality, what is significant, your criteria, what makes someone successful, and your operating system, this whole value system, this worldview which you hold, dictates how you live. Now, being sovereign individuals, that means we're free will individuals. No one can tell us what to think or much less what to do. We make these choices about our value system by ourselves. But the problem is we don't have the long-term wisdom that God would have or even parents would have, especially when we're children. And being short-sighted, we do not choose always the best lifestyle choice, but we choose things that are very short-sighted. They serve the temporary, immediate self-need to make us feel good, to make us feel important at the moment. And those desires that our body's asking us to fulfill immediately. That was the hippie movement. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's about free love. Don't let anyone tell you that anything's wrong. If you want to have sex with anyone, just go ahead and do it. That was their mantra. And so that was their operating system, and they carried it out. Now, those areas where we don't have all the answers, the world fills in the rest. Here's what success looks like. Here's how to be important. You need this to be happy. The pride of life, here's how you got to act to be cool or to be successful. So who fills in these blanks? Some of the greatest cultures around us that fill in those blanks, well, it's Hollywood, isn't it? The biggest thing I hear in Africa when I go there is Western culture, and they're talking about Hollywood, how decadent it is, and it's affecting the youth of their day. Where Hollywood says it's okay to cheat on your wife. It's okay to have multiple lovers. It's okay to do drugs. All the things, and homosexuality is mainstream. They see that, and it's infiltrating their world there, and it's corrupting, and they're crying about it. But that's the God of this world, what he does. Of course, all those other subcultures we talked about, athletics, your favorite celebrity, your favorite politician, everyone's trying to cry for attention, telling you, this is cool, this is how to live, this is how to have success. But it's an ever-shifting goal they offer. When you think you finally arrived, it's moved somewhere else. And when you do get close, it never delivers what it promised. And that's, again, why I suggest the counterculture arises. Because a lot of people look around and say, this is not cutting it. I see so many people that are wealthy, but they're so unhappy. And it's amazing how many people commit suicide who are at the top of their game financially. Then we say, well, I look at musicians and I look at people in the celebrity world, whether the movie stars, same thing exists. They've reached the peak of their field, and they're successful and adored by all, but so many of them end up killing themselves there too. Then they look at the divorce of their parents. And then they reject marriage entirely and say, well, hey, if it didn't work for them, why should I bother getting married? Because it's not important. And so sometimes, not always, the counterculture is a result of reacting to rejecting the world around them at large. And on the surface, I can understand that. They're looking for something else to be different, to be unique, to be authentic, as they would say. But you know what's interesting about the countercultures around us? They all have their icons, don't they? They all have their own peculiar music. They have their own celebrities in that culture. I don't care if it's punk. I don't care if it's a rap artist. If you're in that culture, you could name the celebrities of that culture, couldn't you? When we listen to classic rock, you're listening to the celebrities, the icons of that culture. And so it's interesting. Even though it's a move and rejection of the world at large, they end up doing exactly the same thing. Dress alike, they have their own icons, and they aspire to be like that to be successful. It's their norms and values that they dictate. You have to be this way to be authentic and unique. The more they become different, the more they become exactly alike. It's all how you think, your operating system that you buy into. And so Paul says, you can think fleshly. You can let the world live in you. But as Christians, we realize the only way to truly walk in the Spirit is we have to think spiritually, and that means letting the Spirit dwell in us. So, open your Bibles. First of all, Ephesians chapter 5. You got to do this work so we can kind of just lay some groundwork. There's two parallel passages, both written by Paul, one to the letter to Ephesians, one to the church at Colossae. And in chapter 5, we know in verse 19, this text that we use where we're told to speak to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, making melody in our heart to the Lord. But it's the verse before that I want you to consider. Actually, we'll start in verse 17. Don't be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Let's escape thinking like the world. Let's understand what God wants, his values. And so what does he say in verse 18? Don't get drunk with wine, that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. That's what I want you to consider. Be filled with the Spirit. You say, well, I don't know how to get filled, but I understand the words. You got to get filled with the Spirit, and as a result of that, you'll be speaking in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. You got that? Now look at Colossians chapter 3. Because this is a parallel verse, but Paul says the same thing, but he says it totally different. And he begins in this chapter, about putting off the old man. That's in verse 9. And he says, verse 5, consider the members of your body dead to these things of the world. And he says in verse 10, put on the new man that's renewed by the true image, by the true knowledge, according to the image of the one who created him. And he goes down, so well, how am I going to do that? In verse 15, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. And here it is, verse 16. Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching, admonishing one another with psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Is this the exact same message as Ephesians 5? Sing. Make melody in your heart. One is a result of letting the Spirit dwell in you. Then Paul says the same thing, but he says, let the word of Christ, what? Dwell in you. Is there a connection between the Spirit and the word dwelling in you? Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I'm not going to say that the Spirit dwells in you only by letting the Word be in your mind. Because I think that's probably short-sighted and a little narrow-minded. There's more to it than that. But it starts there. There's no doubt about it, because when you compare these two verses, you're going to let the world's value system dwell in you, or you're going to let the words of Christ dwell in you. And when you let the words of Christ dwell in you, you can say that you're letting the Spirit dwell or live in you. So let's make some sense of this. Jesus, in the beginning, he was called the Word. That's the Greek word logos. I don't expect you to remember it, but I'll just use that word when we think about the Word, the logos. And when we're talking about the logos, Jesus being the Word, we're not talking about just words on the page. We're talking about the truth, the way, the life. As Paul said, the Logos is in Colossians chapter 2, all treasures of wisdom and knowledge are in him, Jesus. If you want to know anything about anything, look to the Logos, Jesus. Because it's he, Jesus, the Logos, that created all things, ordered something out of nothing, and made that which was disordered. He made it ordered. He makes sense of a messed up world. He's the Logos. No one can come to the Father but through him because he is truth. So what is Paul saying? You've got to replace your operating system. No longer thinking like the world, but you got to let God think for you because he knows best. He's the Father of spirits. How do I let him think for me? Let the Spirit dwell in you. Let the word of Christ richly dwell. That's not just I'm aware of it, but I meditate on what he says. I think about it and I incorporate it as my own. So now I'm driving down the road. In front of the fruits of the Spirit is patience, kindness, right? You know the Spirit's dwelling in you when you see the fruit of the Spirit, patience, kindness, self-control. So I'm going down the road, that guy cuts me off, and I almost have an accident in my brand new car that I just got out of the shop from the last accident. And the cortisol rages, and my adrenaline spikes, and I just get angry. Then I go, wait a second. We judge that person, don't we? That's why we get mad. We want vengeance. We want to speak our mind. But that's the way the world dictates. Go ahead and act that way, but the Spirit of Christ tells us something totally different. It says, don't judge one another, lest you be judged. See, that word judge means condemned. See, the world can even use that in the wrong way. They say, don't tell me what my lifestyle is wrong, because that's judging. No, judging is to condemn someone as unworthy. And so because of that, when we have the mind of Christ, we think differently. Wow, I wonder why that guy is such a hurry today. And we don't know his heart, do we? So can we judge them based on their action without knowing their heart? Maybe they're rushing to the hospital because their child was in a severe auto accident. It's in critical care right now. Maybe they were up last night, all night, because their spouse left them for another person. We don't know what's going on in their mind to cause them to speed and cut you off with total unawareness for you. We think it's a matter of disrespect. It's because they might be just lost in another world for that moment. And if we understood what they're going through, would we have a little more patience and kindness? Absolutely. See, the mind of Christ when the Spirit dwells in you, we understand whatever they're going through, I've been there, and I'm glad people were patient with me. And sometimes some people cut you off because they're a little obnoxious, aren't they? They're being a little selfish, maybe a lot selfish. But the mind of Christ, when the Spirit dwells in you, realizes, such were you. I've been that way. I've offended my spouse. I've cut people off. I've lied. I've hurt people. And I'm glad they were forgiving and they were patient and they just didn't kick me to the sidewalk. But they bared with me. They bore with me. Isn't that what Christ has done? And so because I have the Spirit of Christ, it's not love or hate that will conquer. It's love that will conquer all things. I say a little prayer for that person. I say, God, I don't know what's going on in that person's life. But please protect him as he's driving. And please help him from hurting someone else. But whatever's going on internally, I hope that you help them find you. Isn't that the proper response to someone that is cutting you off rather than have rage? See, there's the difference. It's all about what you're thinking internally. What kind of value system you're operating under. And we want the Spirit to live in us. Now, I think there's much more than that because when you have a relationship with God, in this text it says Christ dwells in you. Read also God dwells in you. It's a relationship, but it's so intimate, it overpowers the relationship with my body. All right, say that again. Our body is very intimately. When you want sex, you want to have sex, so you act. That's why a lot of people operate. But when the Spirit dwells in you, have a relationship with God and Jesus and the Spirit, that relationship is so intimate and so personal, it overpowers anyone here. And you can't do the desires of flesh because this trumps it. And that's why the Spirit has said in Romans chapter 8 that when we pray to God because of this relationship, we're exercising it. The Spirit itself intercedes with groanings that we can't even verbalize ourselves. This is what's happening in the spiritual realm, that you're just at your wit's end and you're crying to God. You don't even know what to say. And the Spirit who dwells in us has this relationship, is there by God interceding and said, God, this is what he means. And Jesus, our mediator, is there as well, saying, yep, that's one of our own. Go help them. See, this is the life that happens spiritually, and that's how we overcome the flesh and the world. It's letting the Spirit dwell in us, that I live by its dictates and its values. Now, I have more to say, but we're running out of time. But when you're spiritual, when we're truly spiritual, the Spirit leads us, both fleshly and spiritually. And we who are led by the Spirit, he says, are sons of God. It's interesting. One of the hardest things about letting the Spirit indwells in you initially can be very painful. And I'll try to explain myself. Jesus is the Logos. He's the truth, the way, the life. And when he became the Son of Man, he showed us how all of us should be living like God would live if he was here, because he is God in the flesh. He's the perfect model. So when we let his value system permeate our lives, our minds, immediately we see areas of our life that we need to make corrections. Immediately we see areas like, man, that hasn't been working out. Now I see why. Sometimes there's this emotional response. It's a spiritual response called guilt and shame. They're different, but they're closely attached, where we react to what the Lord has said like, oh, wow, I've been wrong. It's painful to let the Spirit in, because it forces you to face the wrong choices you've been made, where the world has taken over, and it asks you to make correction. And correction means to deny and leave behind and take a new path. And it might have served you well. It's your identity. It's where you get you find success in, or whatever it is. And it's hard to sever sometimes. It's very painful to let the Spirit in initially. But the rewards are so grand and great, because you'll finally be free, no longer held captive by those various desires. And that's why a lot of people don't like to do this. Now, but isn't that necessary with children? In parenting children, the father is with his child, and he sees behavior that's not correct. So you don't want to go down this path, you want to walk this way. And so you correct them, first by instilling the right values in their mind, but sometimes you might have to go to some type of discipline to say, no, this is not the appropriate behavior. It can be painful. And if we don't subject the child to that kind of teaching and instilling in them those kind of values, they will stay a child forever, even though they have adult bodies. It's whatever they want, when they want it, and they whine when they don't get it. I was reading an article by, who's the travel guy, Steve? Rick Steves, and he was talking about ugly Americans in Europe, how not to be an ugly American. And he says other people can be ugly in Europe, but Americans are really good at it, because you can see them. They're around in their air-conditioned buses, and they get out, and it's hot, and it's steamy, and they want their Starbucks coffee, and rather than get immersed in the culture that they're paid thousands of dollars to experience, they want everything America-like. They want eggs and orange juice for breakfast, and when they don't get it, they complain. They complain. And the locals are like, ugly Americans. Now, they know the difference between that kind of person that wants everything their way, and why isn't it? Why didn't you just stay home? If you wanted to be like America, stay in America, right? Then there's others that say, no, we're leaving America behind. We want to experience your culture. We'll eat your foods. We'll walk the way you walk. And we'll become like you while we're here. That's part of the travel experience, isn't it? Now, a child that isn't taught that becomes adult and still continues to whine. And a lot of Christians, chronologically, are very old, but spiritually, they're still infants, because they haven't let the Spirit totally dwell in them and made those adjustments and corrections in life. Now, we can all do it. It'll set you free, because the Spirit will testify with our spirit that we're children of God. There's an inward testimony, and you just know when you're walking in the Spirit and when you're not, don't you? We know. Maybe we call it guilt, and when we're not. So we know, though, when the Spirit is leading us and you feel good about yourself because you're walking in the course of the Creator, the Logos, and you're following His truth and what He holds to be true. And so that's an inward. The outward is the fruits of the Spirit. And that's in Galatians chapter 5. It's, love, joy, peace, patience, steadfastness, self-control, of which things there's no law against. Now, it's interesting what's not in that list. Being sexy. Is that a fruit of the Spirit? Well, that's a fruit of the world, isn't it? Of the flesh. It's not being good looking. It's not being in first place. It's not being wealthy. None of those are in the list of the fruit of the Spirit, are they? And yet, that's some of the characteristics we adapt as our operating system that determines success. So I encourage you, and we'll have to look at those outward fruits of the Spirit that show that you're truly walking in the Spirit. We have a lot more to say, but here's the promise. Walk by the Spirit, and you'll be free. You will not carry out the desires of the flesh. And so I guess the question to ask when we're done is, what are we thinking about? What is our mind set on? What does it dwell on? Is it things spiritual, or we just can't wait to get home to turn on the NFL channel, 254 on Dish, all right? What dominates our thinking? Now, it's not wrong to have those things in life. It's just a side thing. It's just little hors d'oeuvres. But what dominates our thinking? Is it the Spirit? Is it Christ, the Logos? Or is it things of this world? The only person who can make that decision and make that judgment is you individually, isn't it? So I ask you, if you want to come to Christ, the Logos, He'll save you from all your sins. He did for you what you couldn't do for yourself. We have that opportunity. If we can help you in any way, won't you come as we stand and sing?